Retro Future.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bonsert Bogle of Radio Retro Future, steampunk author and creator of the role-playing game Nightwatch. And today we're talking about a topic that has been a long time coming, that being the big stumpy robots we all know and love, that being battle mechs, and in particular what they could be in steampunk settings. And this is in particular a very important topic for me because I'm actually working on my next steampunk novel, The Cascade Girls Engines for the Damned, which is currently in pre-launch on Kickstarter. More on that later. But first things first. What people often get wrong about war machines in any setting, that they assume that the reader just likes the big stumpy robots. But no. There are tropes for a reason, and that means we must adhere to certain genre conventions when including them in any setting. In this video, I want to study what this could mean for steampunk. One of my biggest criticisms of the go-to steampunk universes is Mortal Engines. It is this setting with these massive mobile cities or tracked cities that are moving across this post-apocalyptic hellscape after a certain great war. However, my biggest criticism of the books and the movie alike is that really it presents itself as a sci-fi setting while in reality it's more of a fantasy story. The mobile cities, that is the first thing that attracts people to these things in the first place, is really just set dressing. What I really mean is that the moving cities could have been replaced with floating islands for all I care, and you could tell the exact same story. And that is what I mean when I say that Mortal Engines and similar stories like it are fantasy stories disguising themselves as science fiction. In this video I want to discuss how you can prevent that from happening to your own work. Some people accuse one of the most famous battle robot settings, that being BattleTech, of being the same thing. But I would not agree with that sentiment. And in this video I want to explore why that is. If you know anything about science fiction or even show a passing interest, you are probably familiar with the concept of battle mechs. Either the big stumpy robots from BattleTech or the grim dark monstrosities from the Warhammer 40k universe. Many of you are maybe more familiar with the train-operated nimble battlebots from animes like Gundam or Robotech. Despite the aesthetics being very different, it's interesting how closely the Western and Eastern depictions of the battle machines really are. One of the games that made big stumpy robots very popular in the West is of course BattleTech. Believe it or not, it used to be as big as Warhammer, which is very hard to believe in the 21st century. That said, BattleTech did not come with its original robot designs. If you only have a passing interest in the setting, you are probably familiar with the Harmony Gold lawsuits. From its inception, BattleTech was owned by FASA, who licensed a bunch of battle mechs from Japanese studios. These included some of the BattleTech's most iconic designs, like the Marauder, the Locust, and various others, that were taken straight from the frames of Robotech. The Shadowhawk mech, on the other hand, is taken from a more obscure anime called Fang of the Golden Sun Dogram. What FASA didn't know, however, there was another company called Harmony Gold, which also happened to have licenses for some of those battle mech designs. It turned out to be a litigious company who sued FASA for copyright infringement. For a time, these battle mechs were removed from the series and became the so-called unseen mechs, but eventually the case was settled and the mechs returned to BattleTech proper. The damage was done, however, and Games Workshop, the owners of Warhammer, have taken over the market ever since. These days, BattleTech and other FASA properties are owned by Tops and Catalyst Game Labs, for better or for worse. In Japan, mechs, however, remain king. Throughout the 80s and 90s, there was a plethora of now famous animes like Gundam, Robotech, Macross, Evangelion, and of course, Escaflowne. In all these shows, the robots were very much front and center. In the West, we never really developed this genre of battle mechs. Yeah, we have BattleTech and the MechWarrior series on consoles and PC, but all it ever got was this one animated series, which I loved as a kid, but now I rewatched the updated version by YouTuber Renegade HPG. It didn't really age well, but if you want, you can still watch it on YouTube for free. The funniest thing I can really say about is that the setting is actually treated as a propaganda show in-universe to make fun of clanners. If you know, you know. Despite Mecha being its bread and butter, we do need to realize that BattleTech and its spin-off products are space operas with noble families fighting for dominance. The mech warriors who are piloting the BattleMechs just happen to be the grunts fighting on their behalf, or some unfortunate militia troops fighting a technological and numerical superior force. As I explained, BattleTech had taken a lot of influence from anime, and for those there are just too many to cover. But that said, there are some notable overarching themes that it shares with its Western peers. Be it the original Gundam series or the more grounded armored trooper Votams, who focus on the common soldier, are often deployed at the whim of their leaders. These two are very similar to space operas that emphasize the tragedy in world war, but they do this in a way that does not condemn their audience for liking big stumpy robots. Hence the series play with our boy-like fascination we have for war machines, and that translates into what happens if we are confronted with the horrors of war. And I do mean we, as many of the characters in the series like Gundam, War in the Pocket, are really just about the everyman thrust into the jaws of war by happenstance. Even the BattleTech books that usually have a more pulp-like feel to them often play with these ideas, like in Perfect War, which reach a bit more like MechWarrior Vietnam. Why I include this is to emphasize that Mecha already have their own genre conventions, thus to integrate them into other genres one needs to be aware of these themes and cliches. The steampunk genre is a great framework to explore topics such as progress and ever-changing societies. The protagonists, like in Cyberpunk, tend to use technology in ways it's not intended, kinda like mech warriors. They also tend to be about subcultures that identify with their technology, but I'm going to make a separate video about that soon. The mecha genre tends to focus on vignettes, one mech against another mech, however there always tends to be a greater framework, like the space opera. For most, it would sound like a perfect match. Stories about steam-powered mecha robots fighting wars with constantly shifting alliances and social instability, and yet I don't know any such steampunk setting. Yeah, I mean there are steampunk settings with mechs in them, but they are rarely the star of the show, and if they are, they usually tend to be part of a power fantasy rather than a larger conflict in which the protagonist needs to navigate the shifting balances of power. Even Leviathan, which is more of a biopunk thing, is a typical hero's journey, which is also the reason why so few people actually talk about it. I looked on YouTube if there are any lore videos and I only found book reviews, and that's exactly what I mean. It is just fantasy disguising itself as science fiction. This of course is not to say that BattleTech does not have a power fantasy to it. Hell, even the Warhammer 40k universe is a great power fantasy. But if you ask these people would you want to live in either of these universes, most would probably say no. Except for that one guy that's really into Revelations or something. In BattleTech, it's still a universe where you might get nuked just because some noble feels like it, or get invaded by space pirates, or one mech just waltzes through your house. And if war happens, they tend to last for a whole century, if not longer. But it's that grim darkness, where the anti-war sentiments shimmer through. Yeah, there are, of course, the wonderful Purge memes about the Warhammer 40k universe of destroy all Xenos, but no one considers this to be an aspirational universe like, let's say, Star Trek. And these universes are not about war being bad. It explores why people fight and how societies adapt to said wars. Having a long, wonderful, deep-going description of a mech is one thing, however, to make that mech indicative of something that happens within your setting, that's a whole other thing. Go to the Sarna wiki about BattleTech and read the history of machines like the Blackjack, the Atlas, or the Mackie, just to name a few. These mechs are not just war machines, and they are more than just a solution to a problem. Sometimes they are a solution to a problem that no longer exists, thus making them obsolete. In fact, what I appreciate about the BattleTech setting is that there are so many mechs in that lore itself that are abject failures or so specialized they become obsolete machines. And yet you can still play with them if you like. Regardless, there's a consistent rock, paper, scissors game going on that tells you something deeper about the universe and in that regard, how we as humans behave overall. And that is the constant bouncing around of ideas and cause and effect that is lacking in so much young adult fiction like Mortal Engines and Leviathan books. And here we also need to talk a little bit about the suspension of disbelief. Take the idea of living creatures in Leviathan. Yeah, it sounds cool to have these biological. More likely, it's a complete waste of resources. Mechanical machines like tanks can be stockpiled in times of peace, or, if needed, be used for spare parts to keep other vehicles going. You can do that with biological constructs. You need to feed them multiple times a day, take them out for a walk, scoop their poop, and what to do when the war starts again. You gotta have to breed them like in one go. How does that all logistically work? You cannot set these monsters free and let them swim in the sea, or they're just gonna eat all the fish. And probably they're gonna eat your fishing fleet as well. And then there's just the massive slew of problems that comes with all of this. Even if you would let them stroll around the battlefield, like yeah, maybe they can feed on all the dead soldiers, these will also be your own soldiers, and that's not gonna fly with the families back home. But hey, we have a power fantasy for kids and battle machines fighting monsters, so I guess that's okay. See, and that's what I mean with fantasy pretending to be sci-fi. If you think about it for more than 30 seconds, watch past the amazing art, I mean look at it, and actually start thinking about it, there's just nothing there. And this is a problem with steampunk overall. Few steampunk novels actually are being written, that most of it is literally just fantasy with a steampunk skin, with magic and everything. But yeah, rant over. The question is, how do we fix this? Now, the concept of what we now call steampunk robots is nothing new. In fact, that tradition can be traced back all the way to The Steam Man of the Prairie by Edward Sylvester Ellis, printed in dime novel format. It's kind of like an Edison Age, as we call this genre today, about a young man who built himself a brass robot. The tale follows John Breinert, a young mechanical genius with a physical deformity who builds a colossal steam-powered automaton shaped like a man. The Steam Man. Johnny uses this invention to carry him around like a carriage on his adventures across the American prairies, and together with his companions he goes on a quest for fame and wealth in the Wild West. The Steam Man of the Prairie is unfortunately often overlooked these days, but in many ways it's one of those stories that really popularized the boy genius archetype who uses his intellect to overcome his physical shortcomings. This also makes Johnny Breinert one of the first mecha pilots in literature. But that does beg the question. How does this thing move? Obviously it's steam powered, but how does it use its arms and legs? Does it have a physical difference engine like the Babbage engine? What is the processing power of a physical difference engine anyway? Of course, Edward Sylvester Ellis did not consider any of this, how a robot can do whatever a human can. This book was published in 1868. Even today, few writers actually care about such details afterwards. In Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan, it can easily be explained because the fact that some of these machines are part animal. In fantasy, it can simply be explained with a wizard build it. But how would mechanical robots operate independently in most science fiction oriented steampunk? Even then, does it really matter? BattleTech is more associated with cassette punk. The motions of the robots are controlled with joysticks and numerous buttons that do, well, something I imagine. More importantly are the neuro helmets that translates the mech warrior's thoughts into motion. This is enough to explain why these machines can move like people do. Despite their sluggish appearance in the art of BattleTech, in the books, mechs can jump, move, run, do head flips, whatever. But how does it really work? In interviews, the writers often admit they don't think about it too much and just make it work in a way that benefits the overall story. If you happen to have any form of headcanon that works, there is no right and wrong answer. What we have to ask itself, how mechs controls work is probably the least of everyone's concerns. For instance, how come 100-ton battle mechs walking on two legs do not sink into the ground? How do they not fall over when they get hit? Why do these machines overheat? How do they fit hundreds of missiles in such a tiny space? And how does the storage in legs work? Fans have generated a lot of headcanon to deal with these inconsistencies and open questions, and have collectively agreed on some parts to just simply ignore them. Because the point of BattleTech is to have epic fights with big stompy robots, not to go full Newton on the physics. Now, to be clear, there will never be fast and loose rules on how steampunk mechs are supposed to work. Many will just assume that they are steam powered because, well, the genre is called steampunk. I commented on this so many times now, but I feel I need to repeat it again, that I think the whole steam power thing is dumb. Moving on. However, I do need to stipulate that I use the definition of Bruce Sterling and William Gibson, cyberpunk in the past, and this is important because what steampunk excels at is exploring a past that never existed. especially how our society would have looked like if cyberpunk-esque technology existed earlier in history. During conventions, I tend to emphasize I write alt history steampunk to clarify this is not a fantasy with a steampunk skin. This is also where the space opera comparison comes in. Imagine that warlike civilizations like the Romans, or God forbid the Mongolian horse tribes, got their access to such advanced technology. It would be an absolute bloodbath. In a time of imperialism, however, there could be a genuine arms race based on which empire could produce the most battle mechs and move them around the globe. That means that we're not just talking about the production of battle mechs, but also the means to build ships, trains, and whatever else they need to move these massive machines around. And this is also the type of stuff that BattleTech and Warhammer 40k explore, and it's definitely something that we need more of in steampunk. I mean, yeah, there are the steampunk games that do things like this, but even if you have dystopian wars, epic war machines, we have to ask ourselves, how do these machines move around in peacetime? Did they construct special bridges? It's exactly the reason why Hitler's famous Ratte project was a failure from the get-go. You cannot put it on a trail track, you can't move it across a bridge, the thing just stands there in a victory, because in order to move it you would have to move entire towns. But now I'm just repeating myself. Ignoring details like logistics, that's not the problem here. The real problem is that there is no story behind it. And that is a shortcoming a lot of these gamified settings have. Of course, as a player you don't have to worry about how a machine gets from the factory to the front line. You just set up your armies at the start of the game and that's it. It's simple game logic. Of course, we love the concept behind huge moving fortresses and airborne aircraft carriers, but for those things to make sense in the story, we have to omit a lot of detail. For example, including an actual Zeppelin in the Second World War as a viable combat aircraft. The problem isn't that it is historically incorrect. The problem is that you're going to have to ignore a lot of other available technology, like radar, incendiary ammo, and anti-aircraft guns. That's the real problem. And that brings us back to the suspension of disbelief. In fantasy you can just say magic, who cares? And even in sci-fi we are willing to let such things fly, like in Bioshock Infinite the flying cities is explained with, well, quantum physics. It's basically the creator saying we don't care, and they'll assume that neither will the audience. And in that they're probably correct. But here's the thing, if you the creator don't care, why should the audience? And that is one of the reasons that Bioshock Infinite is the black sheep in the series. Bioshock 1 and 2 take place underwater, which immediately makes it more grounded, no pun intended. And the reason for that is very simple. We don't need to strain our imaginations to see this as plausible. And that is the magical keyword here. Plausible. Like spaceships that go faster than light. Yeah, we know it's impossible now, but few people would think it's implausible. So to suspend that disbelief, we need to strike a balance between what is cool and what is important. The flying islands from Bioshock are cool, but they're also thematic, they have a lot of gameplay possibilities, and it's a cool world to explore. Should we care on how it flies? Well, not really. If it has a type of anti-gravity engine that's based on quantum magic, that's good enough for most people. However, when characters start consistently interact with particular technology or magic for that matter, there needs to be rules. In particular, there needs to be constraints, because what technology can do is often not as interesting as what it can't. When you have constraints, it means that players or protagonists need to become creative to overcome those shortcomings. Take teleporters. Yeah, sure, we can imagine that it can move matter through some quantum physical magic. Not being able to teleport through shields. Yeah, sure, I see how that could work. Beaming people through shields by locking onto their bones, as happens in Voyager. Yeah, that is a lot to buy. You see, this is not a creative solution, it's just lazy. And it's all too prevalent in recent fiction for writers to just ignore those constraints. Long-term fans of the show will notice these inconsistencies and will draw the obvious conclusion that the writers just don't care about the universes they are creating. And again, if the writers don't care, why should the fans? But fans want to care. It's why they become fans in the first place. That means there must be something substantive, there needs to be consistency, and there need to be clear rules and constraints. Only then can they think around solutions and put their imaginations at work. To paraphrase Ursula K. Le Guin, everything in science fiction is a metaphor. If I haven't made myself clear already, a robot cannot just be a robot. When considering building worlds with BattleMechs, it's not just about answering the 5 W's, that being who, how, why, where, and when did BattleMechs in this universe come to be. Whenever you make any invention the center of your story, it just cannot be a ordinary machine. It needs to have a motivation. I'm not talking about a rock, paper, scissors of things. This is good against a tank and that is good against infantry. I'm talking about why was this developed at this particular point in the setting's history. This could be related to ambition, desperation, greed, or a desire to leave a legacy. Ergo, there needs to be a story. Terrible movies, for example. Everyone agrees that The Room is a terrible film that shouldn't have been made. But everyone loves to hear the story behind it because they need to know how such a terrible work of fiction could have made it off the cutting room floor. Then, of course, there is always the interesting realm of unintended consequences. Or the famous 3 laws of robotics, or how the spice melange, which is initially a good thing, can lead to great tragedy. Situational irony has always worked very well in science fiction because it helps us explore the pros and cons of technology that go beyond technological application. Hence, it helps us to explore the conflicts that have no simple solution without having to deal with all that real-world partisan nonsense. So, what about Steampunk Mechs then? Well, for me, it's all about keeping it simple. Well, I don't really need to tell you how to make the visual design of a battle mech. If the design matches its function, then you're probably good. I mean, when it comes to visual design, that's not really a challenge. If your mech is supposed to blow away tanks in one shot, it should look like it can do that job without a problem. So if the form matches the function, you're probably good. But what about the power source? Well, there's no objective answer to that. Some people will insist that it will have to be steam powered. One of my problems I have with the whole steam power fetish is that the Victorians already knew about combustion engines in the 19th century. In fact, by the 1890s, electric cars were already very prevalent. And yet in most steampunks, they can build human-like robots, but petrol seems to be somehow beyond them. Not only is steam very energy inefficient, if a steam engine explodes, it explodes. And that is ignoring all the other downgrades of using steam boilers compared to combustion engines, etc. But if you were someone who can explain to me how steam-powered mechs could work, whilst looking plausible, I'd love to hear. I really do. But till then, the concept of steam-powered mechs is just too fantasy for me. Regardless of power source, what I think the emphasis should be on is how do battle robots come to be in your fictional world? How do the battle mechs? That's the story. More importantly, what are its constraints? For example, let's say you have an anti-air platform. If it comes across a flying creature, that flying thing goes bye-bye. Awesome, but not interesting. But what if that platform is confronted with a heavily armored enemy? Now it has to become creative. Now it has a challenge. And I think that's one of the most important keys here. Create mechs that have to overcome superior enemies. I could go on a tangent on how all of this happens in my setting, the Association of Ishtar, but I decided not to. If you're curious, you can subscribe to our newsletter where I share these types of lore blurbs, or join our Discord where you can give feedback and think along. In fact, I recently wrote a bit of 2 of the first mass-produced mechs in our system, that being the Turkish Kalmech and the British Peeler. You'll also notice that I currently have no art for these mechs. You can help us by supporting us either on platforms like Patreon and Ream. And of course, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Although I am experimenting with AI for various things, I would like to keep the art drawn by actual artists. In fact, if you join us on Ream, you'll get a preview of our take on Steampunk Mechs in the Casket Girls number 2, Engines of the Damned, that I will post on Ream for anyone who supports us there. Meanwhile, I'm working on the third part of that series, so that should come about in 2026. Speaking of which, I'm already preparing our next Kickstarter for the Casket Girls Part 2, Engines of the Damned. It would be great help to this channel if you would give that a follow. and maybe back it when it eventually launches. Of course, the first book in the series will also become available during it, including some of the new STLs that we have in the works, which means you can 3D print your own mechas. If we have enough followers, I might even consider offering physical versions of those mechas during the campaign. Also, Nightwatch or Steampunk RPG, where you can control your own Steampunk Mechs, is nearly ready for distribution. So this will be your last chance to make a late pledge on the Kickstarter, so you can be one of the first people to have a copy, together with all of its stretch goals. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bid you adieu. I hope you found this useful. If you have any more suggestions or want me to make a follow-up video, please leave your recommendations in the channel below. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.